Okay, so let us. I hope you had a nice Shabbos, everyone. Nice weekend. We were in the middle of this concept called Hezek Re'iyah, where the Torah acknowledges that you can be precluded from just looking at your neighbor's property in order to A, not give him an ayin hara, and B, also to preserve his privacy. You're obligated to do that. So we were in the middle of the Imrei Yaakov, where he said that you're not allowed to spy on or even look into your friend's window, your friend's property, look over the fence to see what he's doing in his backyard. And Rod Salomar, and if that's true about a neighbor, then surely a third party who doesn't even live adjacent is not allowed to do that. Rod Salomar de'im lemishu hu dar ba'osa chatzar tzarach lizahar. Certainly, if a person lives as a neighbor within that same courtyard, has to be careful not to peer over and see what his neighbor is doing. Kol shekain lemishu lo dar ba'osa chatzar da'asr liyistakel lechatzar chavero. Certainly, if you don't live in that courtyard, you certainly don't have a right to peer in and see what's going on. Lachatzar chavero. And we talked about this at the end of Friday. If a person is coming, let's say, wants to add a window to his house, and that new window is going to be opening up to his friend's courtyard or his friend's backyard, bein chalon gedola, bein chalon ketana, whether it's a big window or a small window, bein lamayla, bein lamata, doesn't matter how high off the ground it is, bala chatzer ma'akev alav. The owner of the courtyard can tell him, I protest and I don't want you to do it, and can halachically prevent him from opening that window. Shaharei Omer tazikli b're'iyah, ba'afal pishu gavoa tala b'suma matira. He says, you're going to be injuring me. In other words, I don't want to be harmed by your peering at my activities. And even if the window is high, maybe you'll and you don't have access to that window, but you could always, and like your argument is, well, the window is not there for me to, in other words, the window is high off the floor plan. So maybe it's like a close to being like a skylight. So how am I supposed to view anything from that window if I can't even access that window? The neighbor can still say, but you can climb up a ladder and use the window to spy on me. And so I don't want that. And he actually halachically could take him to Beis Din and prevail in Beis Din to prevent him from opening the window. And if he does, he could force him halachically to seal the window. Lirot ba'asakav, and that is it is usher to look at what a person is doing. Shezeh gorim lo hezek. He says, well, just watching what another person is doing is a cause of damage. Shechaver lo yasa asakav b'chotzer mikoch shabosh mimenu. This is like an interesting point. In other words, if I know that my neighbor is watching me, it causes me it to become inhibited, and this causes me damage. In other words, compromising my lifestyle. Let's say I like sunbathing, right, in my backyard, okay, and I have complete privacy in my backyard, so I can sunbathe. And now that you've opened up your window, or you have a way of accessing to look into my backyard, you've inhibited me. Or my wife likes to sunbathe. Who knows what the situation is? So you've inhibited our activity. This is a form of real damage, okay? Or maybe you're causing the neighbor to feel anxious that someone else is going to encroach on his property, or other kinds of damage. In other words, this is an important sort of footnote to this halacha. Causing someone emotional stress because now they are self-conscious that someone is peering into their backyard is a real form of hezek. It's a real form of injury that is actionable according to halacha. You know, a lot of the backyards in our neighborhood have easy visual access from other neighbors. And of course, the halacha is that you're not allowed to look into your neighbor's backyard to see what they're doing. Um, and certainly you're not allowed to create new additions to your house if those additions are going to give you visual access to your friend's backyard where before he had his privacy. So this is just like a really important halach. Va'afilu ro'ehu v'shosek, and even if your friend sees you looking into his backyard and doesn't say anything, you still are not allowed to do it. That's not a sign of tacit approval. He says, Dafka bazeh. It's only if like your friend sticks his head up over the fence and starts looking that you cannot interpret his silence as tacit approval. However, as we'll see shortly, if my neighbor builds a structure whereby he opens up a window that is directly facing my window or directly facing my backyard, and the neighbor is quiet about it. In other words, I'm quiet about it and I don't protest. He says, in a situation like that, if the person doesn't protest immediately over this new window or this new structure that enables a view of his property, then that in itself is a sign of tacit approval. And he cannot therefore come back after a couple of years and say, I'm not happy that you have this new window or this new structure that allows view. When it's time to protest is when the guy is building it. And if after he's built it, there's no protestation, so then it becomes shortly thereafter becomes too late to protest because you should have protested at the time. Okay. Next, nasan lo chavero rishus, that if your friend, so here, the halacha stated, va'filo nasan lo chavero rishus, liftoach chalon lechatzero, lo nisanalo ela laora, that even if your friend gives you permission to open up a new window that's facing his property, that does not give you license to start looking out into what he's doing. He's only letting you open up a window that faces his property because perhaps that's where the best sunlight comes in. But it doesn't give you license to start spying on him and seeing what he's doing. But you're still not allowed to just stand at the window and look out and see what your friend's activities are. So nasan lo chavero rishus, v'im lo nasan lo rishus lahedja, v'hu pasach me'atzma hachamon l'chatzer chavero b'gila daitu d'machalo. Now, this is just a continuation of the previous halach. If I didn't ask my neighbor permission to open up a window, I just decide I'm going to do it on my own, and I open up a window, and my neighbor comes to me and starts helping me construct the window. Or he does something else to demonstrate that he is supportive of this project. Or even if he doesn't do anything to show his support, but rather he's just silent and doesn't protest. This in itself is a sign that he is allowing it to take place. And therefore, after a certain amount of time, he cannot later come and protest and say, I don't want your window there, you have to seal it. As far as how much time must elapse when we consider his silence to be tacit approval, there's a machlokas in the poskim how long that silence is supposed to last. According to the Rambam and those who side with him, immediately after the guy starts the construction project, if I don't say anything, then that constitutes a tacit approval. But according to the Rush, you have up to 3 years as a neighbor to protest the construction of a new window. The Alfal Pi Sharabim Cholkim Utsvirlahu, the Ein Chazaka Mahani Behezek Re'iyah, Avoladina Roi Lahoros de Mahani, Rama. And the Rama actually takes the side of the Rush, because even though there are some who say that when it comes to visual damage, a person cannot stake a claim by saying that he has a what's called a chazaka. He's already established precedent. Nonetheless, over here, the establishment of precedent does work if 3 years have elapsed and the neighbor does not protest. The dafka bazeh, but it's only when there's silence between the two neighbors where there's a question as to whether silence constitutes a tacit approval immediately or if it has to go over the course of 3 years. But if I ask my neighbor permission and I tell him I'd like to build this new window that will, it's going to be on the side of my house that is facing your property, and the guy says, sure, go right ahead, then he cannot later retract his permission. Okay, that everybody agrees to. And even though the neighbor gives me permission to build the window on the side of my house that's facing his property, that does not give me license to stand by the window and just watch everything that he's doing and watch his pool party or whatever. Asr lo la'amod, kedei shelo yazikenu b're'iyasa. And the reason why you're not allowed to just stand there is because that constitutes damage. Uvazeh isura ka'avid. And you're mamish committing an isser. You're violating halacha actively by just standing there. You're doing something immoral and wrong. V'lo mahani le chazaka. And there's no such thing as having a chazaka that I've been standing by this window for years and my neighbor doesn't mind. V'yuchal bal hachatzer limchos bo. And at any time, the neighbor can say, listen, Bob, we've been neighbors for years. And I've noticed that any time I entertain in my backyard, you stand by your window, picking your nose, and you just watch everything that's going on. It's creeping me out, man. And Bob says, well, I've been doing this for years. Why all of a sudden? He says, because my girls are getting older and it really bothers me, or whatever reason he gives. Bob cannot claim, well, I have a chazaka. There's no such thing as a chazaka on a dastardly deed, right? Such as, being a peeping Tom. Okay? The hezek re'iyah havi kigire delay, and damaging someone by snooping on them, by watching what their activities are, is considered to be a form of active damage. And the way that the Gemara calls that, active and direct damage, is called girei delay. It's like a guy shooting arrows into my backyard. Looking into my activities is like my neighbor shooting arrows into my backyard. And there's no such thing as a guy establishing precedent that, well, I've been shooting arrows into my neighbor's property for the last few years, so he can't protest now. That's patently absurd, right? And therefore, there's no such thing as establishing a pattern of conduct over here. All right. So we're just going to go back a little bit and take a look at the Likutim on this halacha before we go on to the next halacha. So we'll start over here. Shnayim shedorim b'chatzer echad. So even though we're talking here now about hezek re'iyah, but now that we're on the topic of neighbors, so in the Likutim, he raises a few issues having to do with neighborly activity and what you can and cannot compel your neighbor to do. Kofen b'nei hachatzer zeh livnos deles ubeishar lechatzer. That all the members of a courtyard, if we share a joint outdoor space that opens up to all of our homes, which is what the standard was in the times of the Talmud, you typically had 2 or more houses that opened up into a courtyard. So all of the members of the courtyard can compel all of the other members if there's like a homeowners association, right? And that's typically what happens, is that it's not a formal institution, but it's the neighbors get together and they say, we really want security and we want privacy. So we would like to build a fence around our courtyard, and we would like to build a door and what's called a beis sha'ar, which is literally a gatehouse. And the purpose of this gatehouse is to allow for additional privacy, because because if there's just a doorway, then it would allow people to look into what's going on in the courtyard. So they would construct some type of like portico that you could enter into, and then there would be a door on the side of that portico, so that by opening the door, you still can't see into the activities of the courtyard. And any other need of the courtyard, the neighbors, by taking a majority, can compel the minority to help pay for it. No neighbor who utilizes the courtyard has a right to recuse himself and say, I don't want to pay for that. That is not of interest to me. If the majority of the homeowners basically say this is something that we all want and we feel it's necessary, so then they can compel the minority neighbor to pay for it. I'm sorry? Oh, afilu, let me just... afilu imlo imzelot tzarach gadol ela shenahagu b'nei hamedina la'asas. And it doesn't have to be something necessarily that's a great need that the neighbors feel that they have, like security. But as long as it's something that's a pretty standard provision, right, that all of the other courtyards are doing, such as maybe beautification, landscaping, or things like that. If it's something that's standard for that community, then they can also compel the minority neighbor to contribute towards. And the same thing is true. Let's say you have an apartment building, right? The homeowners, the condo association or the apartment association, can compel all the neighbors to pay for services to the communal spaces. The im yeshnam dayorim harotzim livnos gader saviv hagina o la'asot intercom b'knisa lebinyan uchadome. Gives a couple of examples. Let's say the residents of the building would like to build a fence around the garden because the garden keeps getting trampled, right? So they want to build a fence around the garden that is on the property of the apartment building. Or let's say they want to install an intercom at the entrance to the apartment building, where previously there was no intercom, there was just a buzzer. Okay. Now you could argue this is not a necessity, it's just a beautification, or it's just an improvement, right? But nonetheless, it is a standard amenity that most apartments have by this day and age, and therefore therefore they could compel all of the residents, as long as you have a majority of residents who want this, or it's the condo owners association, they can compel all of the other residents to contribute towards it. He says, as far as painting the stairwell, right? He says that's an issue actually that's taken up by the Shulchan Aruch. He says, after the Shulchan Aruch Simukut Samach Aleph, Seif Aleph Isa She'ein Kofin. He says the Shulchan Aruch says you cannot compel the neighbors to contribute towards painting the stairwell. Mikol Makom, but that was only back then. Mikol Makom Bizmanenu Ein Derech Ladur B'li Siyud. But today, that's not how we build. That's not how we do construction. Everyone wants a well-painted and a well-lit stairwell, right? So you can't say, oh, I don't want to pay for that because I look at the Shulchan Aruch in such and such a chapter, and it says that a neighbor cannot be compelled to pay for it. Well, yeah, that's true in the 16th century. Go back to the 16th century, and they didn't even have indoor plumbing or electricity. So yeah, so it's not surprising that the neighbors were not expected to pay for the painting, right? And therefore, nowadays, all the neighbors have to contribute towards the paint of the stairwell if they live in an apartment building together. Ule'inyan hotzaot ginun nira de talui lefi hamakom. And as far as paying for landscaping, it would seem that it depends on what is the convention of that community. If it is the norm for the apartment building or the shared courtyard in other courtyards in the community to have landscaping, so then they could compel the neighbors to pay. Now, but again, there's different types of landscaping. There's your basic landscaping. What if the members of the homeowners association want to install, really, really expensive, tulips or roses or things like that, and it's going to cost a lot of money? And can a neighbor protest in that situation? Perhaps he could. Perhaps he could say, "This is a frivolous expense. This is something that you guys in the homeowners association want to do because you have this vanity, that you want to be the nicest apartment in the building in the neighborhood. I'm not interested in paying for that. You want to pay for it? Go ahead and pay for it." So there, it's an interesting question. Is a condo association, by virtue of the fact that they're voted in, do they represent the community interest or the majority interest? It would seem they probably do, and if they want to, they can compel all the neighbors to spend this. But I guess you could create a referendum to vote them out if they do, or like impeach them if they try to create an expenditure that the majority of the neighbors oppose. I'm not sure how it works in condo association, because I haven't really lived in a condo in a long time. But maybe someone can explain it to me if anyone here lives in a condo. But it has to be a justifiable expense, is essentially what he's saying. Another example would be putting new tar on the roof of the apartment building. That's something that all of the neighbors have to jointly participate in, even though a neighbor on the first floor could argue, why should I have to pay for the tar on the top floor of the building? On the rooftop, it doesn't affect me. No, it affects the entire building, because if the building starts to leak, then it could potentially affect even the lower floors as well, and certainly will bring down the property value for everybody. And also even for the painting that it goes on top of the tar that's on the roof. That also, and when you have a roof, let's say it has a utility, for example, that also has to be paid for by all of the neighbors, even though not everyone uses the rooftop. Okay.
Rabbi.
Yeah.
Shmuel.
Hi,
so
Shmuel.
good morning. I live in a condo. Was on the board here for a number of years. So the owners vote the board in, and the board makes the decisions what's going on in the building. If there's a major project going on, it would go to the unit owners for voting to see whether or not they'd agree to the project and how to finance the project.
Give me an example of a major project.
Window replacements in a condominium. It's a multi-million-dollar project, and right. In order to, there's reserve funds that the owners contribute to, and if there's not enough money in the reserve fund, and the project has to go on because of leaks in the building, then the question is how to raise the money, whether or not there's a special assessment where every month everybody pays a little bit more than what they would normally pay, or they would go to a finance company to raise the money that way. So the board still has the ultimate right to do what they want because they were voted in by the unit owners. But in most situations, it goes to the unit owners to see how they feel.
I see.
Yeah.
And is your system representative of what other condo associations do?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
So there you have it.
So it's the board that really decides they have the ultimate decision and ultimate responsibility.
All right, thank you for that. So I'm sure it was very rewarding for you to sit on the condo association board. I'm sure you made a lot of good friends.
Yeah, you know the situation.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. Anyway, very nice. Thank you for that.
Pleasure.
Okay. So let's go on to the next issue in the Likutim. Shadarim b'chatzer echad. Let's talk now about another interesting scenario where you live in a house. You own a house, but you don't live in it. Okay. So, for example, you buy a property in Israel, or you buy an apartment, or you buy, let's say, one of, in like Ir David in Mamilla, where you buy, they say that the house is one of the least densely populated areas in Israel. I should say like this: there are certain neighborhoods in Jerusalem where the vacancy rate is extremely high, even though all of the homes are owned. So in very wealthy areas like in Ir David, which is right outside the old city, there's that neighborhood called Ir David, and most of the units are owned by people who live overseas. So the question then becomes, what if I own a property, whether it's a house or an apartment, and I don't live in it, and I don't use it, it's vacant for most of the year? Can I be assessed for services and utilities that are necessary for the maintenance of the building if I'm not availing myself of that unit? So that's the shaila that's brought in the halacha. So he says, Misha yesh lo bayit b'chatzer ve'eno dar imahem. Let's say I own a house, but I don't live with them. So it's a vacant house. B'kol makom chayev la'asot imahem delet nagar uman'ul. I can still be assessed for essential needs of the entire courtyard. So, for example, a door, a bolt, a lock, I can be assessed to contribute towards. But let's say it's an added expense, which is not a security essential, like building a gatehouse for the entrance. He says that I can push back and say I'm not paying for that. Why is that? He says Bahatam de Beisharhu mitam hezek re'iyah. The argument being is that the whole reason for this gatehouse is to prevent nosy people from peeping in to see what's going on in the neighborhood when the door is open to the courtyard. And I can argue, I don't use the courtyard. I live in another city, and then it's my house, but it's vacant. I'm not using it right now, and therefore there's no reason for me to have to pay for that added expense, which is not considered non-essential. Masha'en kein man'ul shehu avur shmirat guf habatim ze chayav lihishtateif af she'enu darshan. So you know what? I think some of you have to go to Slichas because they start at 7. So I'm going to, the next week or two, I'm going to stop a few minutes early to give everyone time to go to Minyan. All right.